Oh look, it's Tuesday. It must be another Ravi Zacharias Ministries masterpiece on the existence of God. This time out, they try to argue that the resurrection was real. Well, at least that's ostensibly what this video is about, but they really make no effort to back up any of their claims. In fact, they end up playing the victim card that it's so horrible that everyone is against them and their obviously correct beliefs that they really have no way of proving are correct. But of course, it must be everyone else's job to prove them wrong. You know, standard apologetic bunkum. Instead, they want to pretend that unjustified and unsupported claims in an ancient book of mythology are more important than rational science, skepticism, and critical thinking. I don't think so, but let's take a look at their ideas about the resurrection anyhow.
Is it historically reasonable? Are the Gospels historically reasonable and reliable to a certain degree that we can measure as historians? And I think we would say yes, they are. And there are reasons for that, for testifying to the resurrection of Jesus. First of all, we don't just have one Gospel, we have four Gospels. Four Gospels that tell us the same thing, that Jesus was raised from the dead. Second of all, we have Paul's letters corroborating this fact that Jesus rose from the dead. In other words, they corroborate one another because many of Paul's letters, most of Paul's letters, in fact, were written before the Gospels. So here's my third point, here's this Jew who at one point is persecuting the church violently, held the jackets and coats of those who stoned Stephen, as we see in the book of Acts. Yet somehow, this Jew becomes a believer in Jesus and a follower of Jesus, so much so that he becomes the chief apostle and the chief witness, chief apologist, as you will, for the Christian faith. Now, how do you explain that historically?
No. No, the Gospels are not historically reasonable or reliable. I love that they start out making all these kinds of equivocations and using wiggle words. Is it reasonable? They don't ask if it's factually true. They ask if it's reasonable to think that some parts of it are possibly, maybe, conceivably real. Yes, you have four Gospels, but there are 7 books in the Harry Potter series. That doesn't make the existence of Voldemort any more reasonable. We also have good reason to believe that all 4 Gospels ultimately come from the same source, a Q source. They are certainly not 4 independent eyewitness accounts of the same events because they have serious differences between them. They are not remotely consistent on the details of the resurrection story. They provide a different number of women going to the tomb. They provide a different number of angels. Was the stone rolled away when they got there? Matthew disagrees with the rest. Matthew also says there was a great earthquake, which nobody else corroborates. They disagree on whether Mary Magdalene recognized Jesus. With all these clear disagreements, you just cannot take the story seriously. And then you've got Paul, who never actually saw Jesus. He just had an undefined and undemonstrated experience on the road, and we have to go with his claims about the experience, none of which can be proven. How do we explain it historically? We don't, because there's no evidence for these events outside of Paul's claims. No one else wrote any accounts corroborating anything Paul said. No one else saw the miracle. It's just a claim. An unsubstantiated claim. It isn't worth taking seriously any more than the miraculous claims of Joseph Smith or the miraculous claims of Muhammad are worth taking seriously.
And then you have the discovery of the empty tomb being attributed to women. Now, in the first century, women were not considered credible witnesses in a court of law. If a woman witnessed a crime, she could not go to court and testify because her testimony was not taken seriously. So why would the disciples pick women to be the witnesses to the resurrection unless that's really what happened? They were just reporting what happened. And then you have the disciples of Jesus coming to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and like I said, preaching that beginning in Jerusalem and then going all the way to their death. Now, people would die for things that they think are true, even though they're mistaken. They would die for that if they really believe that what they're dying for is true. But if they know that it is not true, if they were making it up, they would have known it wasn't true, and then they would not have been prepared to die for it. And they died in separate places all convinced that Jesus had appeared to them alive after the crucifixion.
First off, women were not witnesses to the resurrection. They were just the ones that found the tomb. Nobody witnessed the actual resurrection. Jesus was long gone before the women arrived. I think this whole narrative played out the way it did for a reason. The women got back and told the disciples, and the disciples didn't believe them, specifically because they were women and not credible witnesses. It wasn't until Jesus appeared to the disciples that most of them believed. This is part of the doubting Thomas narrative, that those who have not seen and still believe are blessed. It would make no sense to the narrative to have it be anyone other than women. But beyond that, Christians continue to make the same kind of irrational mistake. They are claiming that the disciples died for their belief in Jesus. There's no evidence that any of the disciples described in the Bible actually ever existed. About the only one of the early Christians that might have existed is Paul, given references to him by Clement and Ignatius, but even that's far from certain. Claiming that these people died and that somehow proves something is like saying that characters dying in the Harry Potter novels are proof of Voldemort. And even if it were so, even if these were real people who believed they died for something that actually happened to them, that doesn't mean that it actually did. There are all kinds of religious zealots throughout history who have died for beliefs that Christians believe are false. I don't care what they believed. I care if what they believed is actually true, and you just have no evidence for that.
We often find that an immediate objection comes up against an anti-supernaturalism. The person is arguing from philosophical naturalism or materialism, in which their world there is no possible intervention in their system. So basically they believe in a universe of cause and effect within a closed system. And the idea, therefore, is that as Christians or religious people, we are somehow invoking a world of fantasy and unbelief. But we believe in a universe of cause and effect in an open system, that there's an agency that can act. So I think what we've got to define, and I know in my own case when I've had this discussion with people talking about miracles and so forth, or the possibility, is that if God exists, by definition, miracles would be logically possible. I mean, if he's a greater being than by which anything else exists, he is the greatest of all, is he omniscient, all-powerful and so forth, then the very name God carries the attributes of the ability to do anything within his system.
Nobody is arguing that the supernatural cannot exist. We are saying that until it has been demonstrated in some kind of objective manner, we're not going to believe that it does. That's the problem with these supernatural claims. Theists have no means of showing them to be reasonable to accept because they accept them uncritically and without a shred of objective evidence. Rational people do not accept any claim made without evidence. We're not biased against your answer. We're biased against your irrationality. That's like saying that Harry Potter magic is real and anyone who doubts it is biased against Harry Potter. No, that's not how skepticism and critical thinking works. That's shifting the burden of proof. We don't have to prove that you're wrong. You have to prove that you're right, and you've done a piss-poor job of that so far. You believe in an open system? Prove it. Back it up with actual evidence. And if you have no evidence, stop making these ridiculous claims. You don't get to just assume that God exists. You actually have to prove it, and you have failed to do so. You're just pulling this belief and all of the characteristics that you're arbitrarily assigning to God out of your ass and expecting people to take you seriously. Well, guess what? We don't.
And generally speaking, those scholars who presuppose that no God exists will throw up their hands and they will say, we don't know what happened. And I would venture to argue, if your presupposition is that God doesn't exist and that leads you to a dead end, perhaps we can start exploring other presuppositions. Maybe God does exist. We have this whole host of evidence that miracles happen. Maybe there's a miracle that happened here. And in fact, that's what everyone testified to at that time. It's the best explanation by far. And if we as scientists presuppose naturalism, we're doing ourselves a disservice, especially if we don't look into the evidence around us.
Of course, you don't talk about yourself. You know, those people who presuppose that a God exists, do you? And no, there are no scholars who presuppose that God doesn't exist. There are scholars who are waiting for you to back up your goddamn claims that a God exists. When do you think you're going to get around to that? Nobody's biased against your claims. People don't take you seriously because you've entirely and utterly failed to make your case in any objective or rational manner. It's your failure. Stop playing the victim card. Put the hell up or shut the hell up. Pick one. And yes, where we don't know what happened, we don't know what happened. You don't get to just make something up that you cannot demonstrate because you have an emotional hard-on for the idea. Maybe we shouldn't have any presuppositions. Maybe we should just take the evidence as it is and go where it leads without having to color the results with wishful thinking. And no, the best explanation by far is that the Bible is a book of mythology, of stories that never really happened, told by people who are operating uncritically at a time when myths and mythical beliefs were common and rationality and skepticism were virtually unknown. You're talking about people who believed in magic, and you're trying to convince us that everyone ought to believe in magic too because it makes you feel good. No thanks. I accept what is demonstrable. Your beliefs are not demonstrable. The resurrection is not demonstrable. You're not looking at evidence. You're just pretending that your silly God beliefs have to be true because you really, really, really want them to be. Who's being irrational here? It isn't me. Try looking in the mirror. I really get upset at the kind of concentrated stupid that Ravi Zacharias Ministry packs into these short videos. You'd think that anyone with half an ounce of common sense would be able to look at these videos and see the absurdity contained within. These people are just so blinded by their faith in the ridiculous things coming out of their mouths, the things that are not intellectually defensible in any way, shape, or form, but still they believe because their beliefs are not based on intellect, but on emotion. They desperately want these things to be true, but because they want these things on an emotional level, not an intellectual one, they are unable to take a step back and realize just how idiotic these things actually are. Their only justification is, I'm right because I'm right because I'm right. They can't recognize that rational people need more than that. They need evidence. They need facts. And if they have none, they don't just leap to emotionally comforting conclusions. They admit that we just don't know and continue to look for evidence. That's something theists are incapable of doing. They want it to be true because it feels good, not because they have any good reason to think it's actually true, and that's just sad. But what more can we expect from the irrational? Thanks for watching. I hope that something I've said has made you think. Let me know in the comments, and please spread the word. I really want to get the idea that thinking about your beliefs matters out there because we have a whole world full of people who apparently haven't gotten the message. Share, subscribe, and like the video. The more exposure it gets, the more people it reaches, and the better off humanity will become. Let me know if you have any other reasonable length videos that you want me to take on too. I talk about religion, politics, social issues, you name it. I do try to get to everything I'm sent eventually, although longer videos really do take a lot of time, so they do get pushed to the bottom of the pile. I'm sorry. So until we meet again, please think about the things that you believe. It stops you from looking as ridiculous as the religious.